Before the heresy, Fulgrim proclaimed that his legion had achieved a state of perfection, and for their pains were targeted for destruction at Istvan by the ruinous powers. Through their peerless abilities, they survived and ever since have fought tirelessly against the entropy and decline that has afflicted even the Legio and Astartes. With their meticulously maintained marks of ancient equipment and weaponry, they are the epitome of a small but elite mobile strike force. So concerned were the ruinous powers by the Emperor's plan to create the primarchs that they stole the infants away and scattered them throughout the galaxy. Not even this, though, could deflect Fulgrim from his fate. The planet of Chemos, like many before the Emperor's reunification, had been settled during mankind's first expansion into the cosmos, but having lost the gift of spaceflight, had become isolated over the ages. By the time Fulgrim fell to Earth, the inhabitants of Chemos had slipped perilously close to extinction, clinging to survival by scavenging from deserted settlements and endlessly recycling their increasingly sparse stocks of food and water. It was 5 decades later that the Emperor finally set foot on Chemos, and it is a testament to Fulgrim's abilities that in that time he had risen from a foundling to become the ruler of an entire planet. What is more, he had transformed it from a faltering society in terminal decline to a powerful, resurgent world reclaiming the lost settlements and rediscovering long-forgotten knowledge. No longer were they living day by day. Fulgrim had given the population of Chemos hope for the future. On meeting his father and hearing the Emperor's story, Fulgrim was struck by the parallels between their lives. Both had risen to power purely through merits, and the Emperor's great crusade to reunite the lost human worlds into a galaxy-spanning imperium echoed his own achievements and reassured Fulgrim of the truth of his father's worlds. Back on Holy Terra, Fulgrim was introduced to his legion due to a catastrophe with their genesteed. The legion was only 200 strong, but the return of their primarch would change this. In front of the mass Terran dignitaries, and even the Emperor himself, Fulgrim addressed his warriors saying, "We are his children. Let all who look upon us know this. Only by imperfection can we fail him. We are the Emperor's children, and we will not fail him." The onlookers were shocked by the presumption of appropriating the Emperor's name for the Legion, but the Master of Mankind simply laughed and further indulged his son. The newly named Emperor's children were allowed the signal honor of being the only Legion to bear the Emperor's Aquila on their armored breastplates, a distinction that endures to this day. Thus, named and anointed, the arduous process of building the Legion to fighting strength began. In his eagerness to prove himself, Fulgrim volunteered his Legion for duty at the earliest opportunity. Unfortunately, they were so few in number that they had to accompany another force. Fulgrim chose that of the Emperor and his Praetorians, the Imperial Fists. The first meeting between the brothers, Dorne and Fulgrim, was cordial, but this state of affairs did not last. The source of the hostility stemmed from a clash of personalities, and Fulgrim's opinion, perhaps born out of by what followed, that he, rather than Dorne, should be the Emperor's Praetorian. Fulgrim was certainly forthright when it came to criticizing the performance of the Imperial Fists. and was the first to boast of his warriors' achievements to the Emperor. Fulgrim clearly saw himself as a favorite son, and when the Emperor's children finally reached full strength, a lavish ceremony was held on the newly compliant world of Pelthan. Expectations among the Legion were that, at this coming of age, they would take their rightful mantle as the Emperor's new Praetorians, when they were instead merely granted their own expedition of the Great Crusade. A palpable sense of shock and outrage at the injustice spread through the hall. Dutiful son that he was, Fulgrim stood, silenced his troops, and contritely thanked his father for the honor. The voyage from Pelthan was a lonely one for the Emperor's children. There was a sense that their fate, and indeed their entire universe, had been upended. Worse was to come, as the demoralized Legion suffered a succession of grueling drawn-out campaigns of compliance, the last of which left Fulgrim critically wounded. Lord Commander Eidolon immediately suspended the expedition, and the fleet returned to Chemos, fully expecting to lay their primarch to rest on his home soil. Rather than succumb, though, Fulgrim awoke reinvigorated and demanded to address the Legion. He spoke with eloquence and passion that they had collectively been blinded by doubt and fear, but on the brink of death he had been gifted an epiphany. Their path was to seek out and achieve perfection in the arts of war, and once they achieved it, they must hold it unflinchingly. This war is the crucible in which we will be tested. My brothers, in their ignorance, the foul Laer offer us the chance to achieve perfection. Apotheosis awaits. Fulgrim on the eve of the cleansing of Laeron. Just as Fulgrim had done when he first came to Chemos, this second arrival brought hope to the population. Thus armed, the Emperor's children, with Fulgrim at their head, returned to the Great Crusade with renewed purpose, knowing that they would not fail again. After innumerable stunningly successful campaigns that brought countless worlds into the growing Imperium of Man, Fulgrim redirected the fleet from their assigned course and turned them instead towards Xenos world inhabited by a hostile and powerful race known as the Laer. Such was the threat posed by the Laer that Imperial planners had projected any force attacking them would be wading through rivers of blood for decades. As the Laer were seemingly content in their isolation, they had never been left until now. Fulgrim, however, saw them as his legion's greatest test. He would exterminate them, and furthermore achieve this task within a standard solar month. The Emperor's children found that rather than a single race, the Laer had adapted and specialized their bodies to such a degree that they were barely recognizable as the same species. The only traits they held in common were a mastery of their own sphere of combat and the desperate tenacity of those facing total extinction. The war wrought a terrible toll on both sides as weapons of incredible power were unleashed. The skills of the Legion's apothecaries, long the guardians of genetic purity, shone as they performed miracles in keeping their brothers alive and fighting. From the weightless conditions aboard orbital defense platforms to dogfights among freezing clouds and lethal close-range meat grinders, aboard deep submersible habitats, the Emperor's children scoured the lair from existence. The very last lair was cut down in one of their blasphemous temples, 3 days before the allotted month was out. Despite being regaled with tales of its haunting beauty, Fulgrim declined to tour the site, saying he had no wish to so dignify the Xenos or their superstitions. He instead had the fane pounded to dust by orbital bombardment, along with every other remnant of Laeran culture. Back in orbit around the dead world, Fulgrim addressed his entire legion. He said the campaign had proved that they had indeed achieved the Emperor's perfection. Driven to constantly change and adapt, the Laer had twisted their minds and bodies beyond all recognition, and yet the Emperor's children had defeated them through their unsurpassed skill and devotion to purity. Similarly, the Legion must be wary of diluting their Emperor-given state of perfection in the guise of progress, as to corrupt the ideal in this way would be an unforgivable act of sacrilege. On that day, the Emperor's children became a bastion of constancy in an ever-shifting galaxy. Addendum: Fabius Bile. Despite Fulgrim's declaration that the Emperor's children had reached perfection during the Laer campaign, a small faction within the Legion defied their primarch's injunction. Most prominent amongst these conspirators were a group within the Apothecarian, who covertly continued their experiments under the cloak of treating their wounded brethren. These perversions included rewiring the pleasure centers of the brain, and even using Xenos biological material from the vanquished Laer in their blasphemous works. This unforgivable breach of discipline was swiftly rooted out on the voyage to Istvan. The leader, a talented but misguided apothecary by the name of Fabius Bile, took the coward's way out rather than having to answer to Fulgrim's for his crimes. By the time they were able to break into the Apothecarian, Bile's body had been rotted to an organic stew inside his armor by powerful enzymes. If he had lived, Bile's punishment would undoubtedly have been an order of magnitude worse. No sooner had the Emperor's children reached their apotheosis than they received an urgent astropathic communique concerning the Ultramarines. Guilliman's Legion had brought much of the far galactic east into Imperial compliance, but now, by right of conquest, had claimed the area as their own. Rather than showing dismay and disbelief that one of his brother primarchs could turn his back upon the Emperor, Fulgrim took the news with quiet satisfaction. It reinforced his feeling of superiority, and gave him the chance to put his legion to the test against the closest thing that remained to a challenge: other Astartes. The only thing to sour the moment was the news that the force sent to discipline the Ultramarines would be commanded by his adversary, Dorne. The Emperor's children set course for the Istvan system. It was the site of Guilliman's latest addition to his Ultramar segmentum, and both the rebellious Primarch and much of his massed legion were present on the 5th planet. 7 legions were called to Istvan, with the Imperial Fists, Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Dark Angels making planetfall first to encircle, devastate, and demoralize the defenders. The Emperor's children, World Eaters, and Raven Guard were given the task of falling upon what remained to administer the coup de grace. On Dorne's command, the 3 legions descended from orbit, only to find themselves caught in an ambush. Far from demoralized, they found the Ultramarines well dug in, heavily armed and highly organized. Landing craft were torn apart by concentrated anti-aircraft fire, and drop pods incinerated before their hatches were ever blown. Under the peerless leadership of the Emperor's children, the mauled remnants of the Free Legions rode out to link up with their supporting legions, only to uncover the true depths of the betrayal, as their erstwhile allies also opened fire upon them. The calm channels were awash with pleas for their brothers to cease fire, and it was Fulgrim who first guessed the terrible truth. This was no accident. Dorne had betrayed them. The Emperor's children vented their frustration on the turncoats before them, and Fulgrim led what remained of his personal retinue against the primarch of the Iron Hands. Fulgrim had considered Ferrys Manus to be a rare friend rather than a rival, and so the betrayal was all the deeper. Legion records tell that Fulgrim managed to mortally wound Manus, and even sever one of his fabled metal hands. Sadly, this account has been proved to be horrifical, as Manus was later seen on Mars, and personally commanded his legion in the Gothic sector, as recently as early M41. Through daring skill and determination, a tiny fraction of the 3 legions escaped back to orbit to spread word of Dorne's great betrayal to the wider Imperium. Despite their brutish demeanor, the World Eaters had impressed Fulgrim on the fields of battle, and genuine bonds of friendship were forged that persist to this day. Corax and his Raven Guard left, as was their way, silently and swiftly for their homeworld. Though it pained Fulgrim to do so, it was agreed that their numbers were so few that only option was to return to their homeworlds and rebuild their allegiance for the inevitable fight back. The Emperor's children had risen from the ashes once, and they would do so again. Despite their betrayal and near extinction at Istvan, Fulgrim's assertion that his legion had achieved the heights of perfection remained unshakable. If anything, these events reinforced his view. They could not have been corrupted or defeated in a fair fight, so instead, Dorne had tried and failed to obliterate them beneath overwhelming numbers. Dorne's heresy was brought to a bloody end before they could properly reconstitute their losses. Chief among the casualties was the Emperor himself, who was left as little more than a ghost in the Astronomicon machine. Although Fulgrim never spoke openly of it, he clearly grieved for his father, and perhaps even regretted his choice to rebuild the Legion rather than trying to fight their way back to Terra. Dorne, the arch-betrayer, was dead, and yet other traitor legionnaires still drew breath. The urge to track them down and mete out bloody retribution was powerful, yet Fulgrim never once compromised his principles to boost their numbers. Only the finest recruits were inducted into the Emperor's children, which meant that while their high standards were maintained, the Legion remained pitifully small. For this reason, they deigned to fight alongside other loyalist legions, first with the World Eaters, where they saved the planet of Skullfrax from the Salamanders, and eventually took their place in Abaddon's massed crusades. To finally strike back was cathartic, but Fulgrim was horrified at the shortcuts the other legions had taken to replace their losses, in particular the new inferior marks of war gear being rushed into production, though it significantly slowed the rate at which the Emperor's children could reconstitute their ranks. Fulgrim was confident he had made the right choice. They would not compromise their principles and their purity. Even since the dark days of the heresy, the Emperor's children have been dedicated to the protection of the Imperium. However, while they do fight against Xenos incursions and bring heretical regimes back into the Imperial fold, they rarely see such opponents as a worthy challenge. Their real passion is ignited by the chance to test themselves against the traitor legions, and especially those that betray them on Istvan. It was Fulgrim who proposed the crusade against Rabute Gilliman himself, that it was their duty to finally end the existence of the man who had triggered the heresy. It was Fulgrim who led the 9 loyal legions deep into the hostile territory of Ultramar Segmentum, and it was Fulgrim who met and bested Gilliman on the blood-soaked world of Prandium. Such a deed would have made Fulgrim the only person, bar the Emperor, to have killed one of the traitor primarchs, and yet he willingly forewent this singular honor in favor of a far more fitting punishment. Using their superior pre-heresy technology, the Emperor's children placed the dying Gilliman within a temporal stasis field and returned it to Holy Terra so that his eternal torment might be witnessed by the Emperor. The body is housed within the deepest vaults of the Purgatory Falls sepulchre, and although it should be impossible, it is said that the agonies of his long final second have been felt by generations of telepaths down the millennia. Of Fulgrim's own fate, nothing is known for certain. He disappeared without a word from the inner sanctum of his flagship, the Pride of Chemos. Much has been read into the physical evidence in the chamber, such as the etched adamantium wall panels. Some speculate that it was caused by some unknown type of weaponry. Others said that Fulgrim had ascended to another spiritual level, and that it was a physical manifestation of this transcendence. Few, though, in the Legion truly believe that their Primarch is dead. They only differ over how and when he will return. Before the arrival of Lord Fulgrim, Chemos was isolated from the wider galaxy, its inhabitants clinging to existence on their desperately polluted world. Fulgrim reversed this decline, proclaiming previously abandoned settlements and giving the population hope for the future. With the arrival of the Emperor and an influx of Imperial technology, this development leapt forward dramatically. Chemos became the site of the Legion's fortress monastery, and extensive new mines and manufactories were built to arm the Emperor's children for their wars in the Great Crusade. This increased level of production darkened the skies with pollution, an image akin to the desperate days before the coming of the Primarch. This, along with the desire for perfection and the call of his artist soul, prompted Fulgrim to decree that they would turn the planet itself into a place of beauty, a world fit for the children of the Emperor. Using influence that only a Primarch could wield, Fulgrim ordered that the planet be terraformed. Pollution was scrubbed from the air and water, and Chemos was transformed into a wild, verdant world of azure skies, shining lakes, and deepest forests. So as not to spoil this ideal, Fulgrim also ordered the manufactories, mines, and main pollution centers be relocated below the surface in vast, hermetically battlefield caverns. Such a mighty task took many centuries to complete, interrupted as it was by the heresy, the near destruction of the Emperor's children at Istvan, and the dark times that followed. Eventually, Fulgrim was rewarded for his labors with a world to rival even the luscious pleasure planet in its beauty. Only the Emperor's children themselves and civilians charged with the upkeep of the environment and for the production of fresh food for the region are allowed access to the surface. The remaining population labors endlessly in the buried hive cities, producing the pre-heresy patterns of equipment and weapons demanded by the Emperor's children. The skill of these artisans in keeping alive knowledge of patterns and marks used during the Great Crusade is unparalleled, even so they boast by the adepts of Mars. Sadly, despite their best efforts, the beauty of Chemos has faded over the millennia. In the absence of the Lord Fulgrim, entropy has taken a heavy toll upon the little understood terraforming equipment, and the catastrophic cave-ins have scarred the once pristine world. In addition to the death toll, these disasters have caused irreversible losses of ancient technology. For instance, Persuai Subhive was responsible for vital power generation systems used in Mark III Iron Pattern power armor. The catastrophic collapse that destroyed it in the late M39 has meant that ever since these suits have incorporated non-authentic elements cobbled together from later marks, to this day, search teams still excavate the ruins of Persuai, ever hopeful that the lost knowledge might one day be reclaimed. Addendum number 2. The Chemos Curse. From orbit, Chemos was infamously compared with the face of an aging courtesan, far past her prime, but gamely applying rouge and powder to cover her pitted, pock-marked face. Admiral Markovich received orders to patrol the Ghoul Stars shortly after uttering this unflattering witticism, a tour from which his grand cruiser and escort cadre never returned. This has led to an Imperial Navy superstition that to speak ill of Chemos is deathly bad luck, and that anyone doing so is roundly flogged, be they the lowliest ship rating or the commanding officer. While other legions have increased in size and adapted their command structures over the millennia, the Emperor's children have defiantly remained the same. They are composed of 30 grand companies, the same number that made up the legion during the Ascension of the Laer campaign. Each grand company is led by a Lord Commander, an instrument of Fulgrim's will, who, through his subordinate captains, directs upwards of 1,000 Marines. Respect for their superior officers is ingrained into the psyche of the Emperor's children, with each successive rank moving closer to Lord Fulgrim, and by extension, closer to an unquestionable ideal. The excessive care taken over both gene seed purity and the caliber of new recruits has meant that even in the aftermath of the Istvan betrayal, the Emperor's children have never compromised their standards, simply to fill out the ranks. Similarly, given the degree of time and effort required to produce their venerated war gear, it is unsurprising that they are by far the smallest of the Emperor's legions. What they lack in numbers, they say, is more than compensated for with their unparalleled skill. This is something which they are all too eager to demonstrate to Astartes of other legions, be it in the dueling cages or on the battlefield against the Emperor's enemies. Among Lord Commanders, there is a strictly defined hierarchy. In the absence of Lord Fulgrim, what would elsewhere be called the post of Legion Master resides with the Lord Commander of the First Grand Company. Even before the heresy, each Grand Company had its own favorite style of combat. This was a reflection of their Lord Commander's personality, something encouraged by Fulgrim himself. This was reflected in unofficial but enduring names for each Grand Company. For example, the 7th Grand Company are informally known as the Hawk Lords for their unmatched skill at aerial warfare with Raptor, Pack, and Jetbike. With all their hearts, the Emperor's children believe in their own purity and innate superiority. They cling tight to Fulgrim's assertion that they have achieved perfection just before the heresy, and will do nothing to dilute this, be it with the new inferior marks of weapons and equipment, or accepting anything less than the most pristine specimens of gene seed. This obsessive attention to detail means while the Emperor's children will never be a large legion, each member is a paragon of what it means to be an Astartes. They believe that the only being to surpass them is the Emperor, and while they do not view him as a god, their respect and admiration for him is unbreakable. Fighting alongside allies such as the Imperial Army or even Astartes from other legions is often a source of friction. Their superiority can sometimes be mistaken for arrogance or high-handedness. Despite this, the Emperor's children enjoy demonstrating their skills to others, but ultimately are most comfortable fighting alone, where they only have to rely upon their own trusted battle brothers. Since the Gene Seed disaster that nearly wiped out the Legion in its infancy, the Emperor's children have taken obsessive care in the screening of implants. This solemnly duty falls to the Legion's apothecaries, from the battlefield harvesting of progenoid glands from critically wounded brethren, to the testing, culturing, and implantation into new recruits. They are the guardians of Fulgrim's genetic legacy. As such, the gene seed of the Emperor's children is of unmatched purity, with all 19 implants working as well today as when they were first gifted by the Emperor. Despite the stability of Fulgrim's gene seed, the stringency of the screening process still results in a relatively high proportion of rejections. Although this is in part compensated for by an implantation success rate unmatched by the other legions, it does mean that the Emperor's children are slow to replace brothers lost in battle. The Legion has been brought twice to the brink of destruction, and twice they were emerged triumphant. They see this as a testament to the strength of their gene line, and a vindication of their zeal in guarding its integrity with terminal intensity. By a long tradition, the progenoid gland in the chest is surgically removed as soon as it matures. While the second is harvested only upon the Marine's death, the early elective removal of one progenoid minimizes the chances that it will be damaged or subjected to contamination. In the event that some catastrophe should destroy the Legion's stocks of gene seed, the surviving battle brothers carry within them the means to continue the Fulgrim line. As a Legion that faced extinction on more than one occasion, the Emperor's children are acutely aware of the need to consider such things. And as for their battle cry, the Legion has, of course, kept this pre-heresy battle cry: "Children of the Emperor, death to his foes." These are the loyal sons of Fulgrim. In their pride, they cannot see the doom that awaits them.